Hey all, Professor Carafit here. Let's talk about early life. So we're talking about chapter 24 here, especially prokaryotes and viruses. So we know from previous lecture work that the Earth is around 4.6 billion years old. And the first life shows up around 3.5 billion years ago. And those first life forms would have been prokaryotes. Prokaryotes is not really a clade, really. It's more of a generic term we use for the domain bacteria and domain archaea. They are both unified in the fact that they lack membrane-bound organelles and they're very small cells. Okay, so and the domain archaea seems to be a little more closely related to eukaryotes like us, but they both lack organelles. They're both small. Now, where did these things come from? Well, we know some of the steps that had to have occurred for life to originate. So we call this biogenesis, basically, the origin of life. And it's different than the study of evolution. Evolution focuses on how life changes over time, not where life comes from. So, of course, there's hypotheses about asteroids bringing molecules to Earth and all kinds of things. I'm just going to loosely touch on the things that had to have happened for life to start on Earth. The first thing is the abiotic, meaning without life. The abiotic synthesis of small organic molecules, followed by the joining of those molecules into macromolecules. So we're talking about the abiotic, meaning without life, formation of things like amino acids. And some of those amino acids joining together to make small proteins, okay? And the same with the other categories of macromolecules that you would have learned about in Bio 1. Now, that's possible. These are things that can happen. They're not something that we say, well, this had to have happened, but we don't know how. We can see that it can happen. So these are things that are realistic. Number 3, packaging of molecules into what we call protocells. Protocells are membrane-bound spheres that are kind of like a cell, but they're mostly like a bubble of phospholipid. They have their own internal chemistry that's a little bit different from the outside world, so they have a form of homeostasis in that sense. And they can often pinch in half and divide. So they're not really alive, but they exhibit some of the behaviors of life. And these we know can form. We formed them in a laboratory before. They can form when there are lipids floating around in water. They can form on their own. And then the last thing that would have had to have happened is inside of those protocells, we get some kind of self-replicating molecule, sort of like genetic material. Okay? So once you have a membrane that can replicate, and inside of that you have molecules that can replicate and pass on information, then you're basically at the cusp of what we might call a cell or something that's alive. So those are the 4 things that need to happen. So protocells, as I said, they're fluid-filled sacs, basically vesicles made of membrane, like a phospholipid membrane, and they can form spontaneously. I have a typo there. They can form spontaneously all on their own. They're semi-permeable, and they can pinch in half and divide through very simple reproduction. Now, what we know based on our studies of chemistry and things is that the first genetic material on Earth was probably RNA. Now, our cells have RNA, but their primary genetic material is DNA, right? That's how we pass things on. But originally, we think it was RNA. It's a little bit simpler molecule, and it's less stable than DNA, meaning it can mutate more easily. And it was likely copied by ribozymes, which are enzymes made of RNA, essentially, that can self-replicate. So likely there was some kind of self-replicating ribozyme that could cause RNA to replicate. And because RNA mutates a lot, RNA ribozymes that left a lot of offspring and copies of themselves were likely to leave more descendants. So it's almost like chemical evolution. And eventually, that single-stranded RNA may have been used to make DNA templates like it is today in our cells. And then finally, DNA would have arisen as the molecule of inheritance. It was a little bit better than RNA because it's double-stranded. You know, it's double-stranded with those hydrogen bonds, and it's more stable. It holds together better and is more accurately copied than single-stranded RNA. But likely the first genetic material is RNA. So you'll see your book talk about the fact that it was an RNA world before DNA came on the scene. RNA was probably the first molecule of inheritance, copied originally by self-replicating ribozymes. Just to remind you, a ribozyme is a molecule made up of RNA that can act as a catalyst. So an example of that is your ribosomes. Your ribosomes are composed of rRNA, ribosomal RNA, and they act as a catalyst to form proteins, right? So that's where that word comes from. Okay, so that's what had to have happened to get life originating. And your book talks about the Urey experiment, or the Miller and Urey experiments, where they, I think it was Miller who put electricity through an atmosphere that represented early Earth's atmosphere, and we could see that it generated amino acids and things. And we know from more recent experiments with different models of how the atmosphere might have been that producing organic molecules is completely possible based on the early atmospheric conditions of the Earth. But however it happened, we know that around 3.5 billion years ago, we have fossils called stromatolites on Earth. And stromatolites are basically rocks, layered rocks that are deposited by bacteria. And we even have them still around today, living bacteria that make stromatolites, like here in Australia, you can see them. And the ones that we have today are made by cyanobacteria. So that's what they look like today. Now, what we can see if we go back in time, we can see that it was probably, these protocells and things were probably formed with clay. There are certain kinds of clay that act as a catalyst for the formation of these vesicles that lead to protocells. If that clay is around, the amount of protocell production goes way up based on studies that we have seen. So if that clay, which we think could have been around in the early Earth, could have acted as a catalyst, making protocells very, very common. And at the same time, or shortly thereafter, I should say, when these protocells would have been developing, we see these fossil stromatolites in the fossil record 3.5 billion years ago. And so stromatolites show up quite a ways back. And then we have evidence of other non-photosynthetic bacteria as well at that time. And sometime, at least for sure, by around 1 billion years ago, we have cyanobacteria, photosynthetic bacteria. They could go back even further, but the evidence is a little scarce yet. So photosynthesis evolves as well shortly after the evolution of the non-photosynthetic bacteria. And what happens is, after the non-photosynthetic bacteria give rise to photosynthetic bacteria, what we have is what is known as the oxygen revolution, which happens somewhere around 2.5 to 2 billion years ago. That's when the Earth's atmosphere, which was very poor in oxygen, very low in oxygen, has a giant increase in the amount of oxygen on the planet, because, as you might remember, oxygen is a byproduct of photosynthesis. So photosynthesis evolves, and it completely changes the Earth's atmosphere into an oxygen-rich atmosphere, an oxidizing atmosphere, which is going to cause a lot of prokaryotes to go extinct, because a lot of those early prokaryotes would have preferred an oxygen-poor environment. But now we have an oxygen-rich environment, which allows cells that survive that change to utilize energy more robustly as they evolve the more modern form of cellular respiration, where oxygen acts as the last electron acceptor in the electron transport chain, which you learned about in Bio 1. So what we see is life shows up. If we were doing a countdown here and the modern Earth was a clock, life shows up around 45 minutes into the day, as it were. But life shows up several billion years ago, and shortly thereafter, atmospheric oxygen shows up when photosynthesis evolves. And as we'll see after that, the eukaryotes evolve, which will be the next chapter. But they don't show up till more than halfway through a 60-minute timer here, the eukaryotes. Okay, so I'm I'm going to stop this video here, but what we've seen in this video is what had to happen to cause life to form, what steps would have had to have taken place, and some of those structures like protocells and self-replicating genetic components and things. Where we'll pick up then is we'll look at bacteria and at archaea and learn about some of their features and characteristics and some of the diseases that are caused by them.